stand on a street corner in Rome around the year 50 AD. Pick a spot near the forum where the crowd is thick. Now count the next 3 people who walk past you. Statistically, one of those 3 is not a person, not legally. That individual is a thing, an object, property in exactly the same category as a chair, a cart, or a mule. And here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Looking at those 3 people, you would have absolutely no way of telling which one it was. No badge, no brand on the face, no distinctive haircut, no required color, nothing. A Roman slave dressed like a poor Roman, which is to say, like most Romans. That was not an accident. It came up in the Senate. Somebody stood and proposed that slaves should be made to wear a distinctive uniform so that free citizens could tell at a glance who they were dealing with. The proposal was killed almost immediately. Seneca tells us why, and his explanation is one of the coldest sentences to survive from the ancient world. It became obvious, he says, how great the danger would be if our slaves should begin to count us. Read that again. They did not reject the uniform because it was cruel. They rejected it because a uniform is a headcount. And the moment the enslaved could see how many of them there were, the arithmetic of the entire city changed. So let us do the arithmetic they were so afraid of. Historians argue about this constantly, and the honest answer depends entirely on where you are standing. In Roman Italy under Augustus, the estimate lands around 30%. In the city of Rome itself, some estimates go as high as 40%. Out in the provinces, in Egypt or Gaul, it drops to 10 or 15. So 1 in 3 Romans is not a figure for the whole empire. It is a figure for the heartland, for the place the Romans actually meant when they said Rome. Which means the city that gave us the republic, the senate, the laws, the roads, the aqueducts, and the phrase innocent until proven guilty, was running at roughly 1 enslaved person for every 2 free ones. And they did not think of this as a moral emergency. They thought of it as Tuesday. Nobody in the ancient Mediterranean was campaigning to end slavery. Not the philosophers, not the poets, not the emperors. The question people asked was never whether slavery should exist. It was only ever how a decent man ought to manage his. So, where did a third of a country come from? There are 4 doors into Roman slavery, and the first one is the obvious one: war. A Roman victory did not end with a surrender. It ended with an inventory. The surviving population of a captured town was walked to the coast and sold, and the numbers involved are difficult to hold in your head. After one campaign in Gaul, Caesar's own account claims tens of thousands sold in a single day. The Roman army was, among other things, the largest supplier of human beings in the ancient world. Conquest was not just how Rome got land, it was how Rome got staff. Door 2. Piracy and kidnapping. The Mediterranean was thick with slavers for centuries. Coastal villages simply vanished. Merchants disappeared between ports. This is not a background detail either. It happened to Julius Caesar personally. He was captured by pirates as a young man held for ransom and reportedly spent his captivity telling his captors that he would come back and crucify them all. They thought he was joking. He was not. Door 3 is the quietest one, and by the imperial period it was the biggest, being born into it. The Romans had a word for a person born enslaved in the household: verna. And the legal principle was brutally simple. The status of a child followed the status of its mother. If she was property, the baby was property from the first breath. Owners actively encouraged this. A homeborn slave cost nothing at market, spoke the language, knew the house, and had no memory of ever being anything else, which was considered a feature. And door 4 is the one modern viewers always find hardest to believe. Some people were not captured at all. They walked in voluntarily. Abandoned infants were routinely picked up and raised as property. Parents in crushing debt sold children. Adults sold themselves because a slave in a wealthy household ate every day and a free laborer did not. That is the detail that tells you the most about the ancient world. Slavery was so ordinary that for some people it was not the worst option available. So 4 doors in. But almost everybody went through the same room on the way, and we know what that room looked like in uncomfortable detail, because the Romans regulated it. There were rules, there was paperwork. A person for sale stood on a raised block so the crowd could see them properly. They were usually stripped because buyers wanted to inspect for injuries and old scars. And around the neck hung a small board. On that board, the dealer had to write where this person came from, what they could do, what illnesses they had, whether they had ever tried to run, and whether they had ever attempted to kill themselves. Read that last one again because of what it implies. The Roman state required that information to be disclosed at the point of sale, not out of compassion, because it affected the value and because a buyer who was not told could take the seller to court and get his money back. It was consumer protection. The consumer was the one being protected. There were other conventions. Prisoners brought in from outside Italy had their feet whitened with chalk, so buyers could tell at a glance who was newly imported and who had already been in Roman households. And there was a returns policy. If your purchase turned out to have a defect the dealer had concealed, you had 6 months to bring them back. There was a defined warranty period on human beings, and Roman lawyers argued about the fine print of it for centuries. Some of those arguments survive. They are very dry. Prices varied the way you would expect and hate. A laborer cost roughly what a good mule cost. A trained secretary cost many times that. A beautiful young person costs more than either for reasons the sources are perfectly open about. And this is where the whole thing stops being abstract, because a price list is a document that tells you exactly what a society believes. Rome wrote down in numbers what a human being was worth relative to a mule, and then filed it, and moved on with the afternoon. Now, if you are picturing all of these people doing the same thing, stop. Roman slavery was not one job. The range is enormous, and it is the range that makes the whole thing so hard to think about clearly. At one end, you have a man who is the household tutor. He is Greek, he is better educated than his owner, he teaches the owner's children philosophy and rhetoric, he eats well, and he sleeps indoors. He is also, legally, a chair. There were enslaved doctors, enslaved accountants who ran the finances of huge estates, enslaved architects, enslaved secretaries who managed the correspondence of senators. If you needed a skill in Rome, there was a decent chance you owned it rather than hired it. And at the other end of the range, there are the mines. Being sentenced to the mines was not a job. Roman law treated it as a form of execution, and everybody understood it that way. You went underground, and you did not come back out. The work was done in the dark, in the heat, in air that killed you slowly, and nobody kept records of names because there was no reason to. Between those two ends sat the farms. That is where most enslaved people actually were, not in the elegant townhouse and not in the mine, but on an agricultural estate, working the land, sleeping in a barrack block, being counted at dawn. And we know exactly how the men who owned those estates thought about them, because they wrote it down for each other. There is a surviving Roman handbook on running a farm that classifies your equipment into 3 types. Type 1, the mute equipment, meaning your carts. Type 2, the semi-vocal equipment, meaning your oxen. And Type 3, the vocal equipment. That is the category the people went in. And inside the house it went further, because a rich Roman household did not have servants who did several jobs. It had specialists, dozens of them. There was a man whose entire job was to stand at the front door. Some households chained him to it. There was a man whose job was to walk slightly behind his owner in public and whisper the names of approaching citizens into his ear so the owner could greet everyone warmly and appear to have an excellent memory. There were people who existed to carry the litter, to dress the hair, to fold the clothes, to read aloud during dinner, to taste the food first in case it was poisoned. And that is the detail that gives the game away. A household with a food taster is a household that is considered the possibility of being murdered by the people inside it. They knew. Everybody in that house knew what the arrangement actually was. They simply had a system for it. Which brings us to the law itself, and Roman law is the reason this system worked so smoothly for so long. It was not chaotic, it was meticulous. An enslaved person could not legally marry. They could form a relationship, live as a couple, raise children, and none of it existed on paper, so all of it could be sold apart on any given morning without breaking a single law. They could not own anything, technically. They could not bring a case, and their evidence was not admissible in court unless it had been extracted under torture, because a thing cannot swear an oath. There is a Roman farming manual that advises the careful owner to sell off worn-out oxen, sick sheep, old carts, scrap iron, and aged slaves. It is presented as sensible household economy. It is a list. They are on the list. And then there are the individual stories, which are worse because they are specific. One wealthy Roman kept a pool of eels and was said to throw slaves into it when they displeased him. That story survives specifically because other Romans found it shocking, which tells you there was a line. It also tells you exactly where the line was and how far past ordinary cruelty a man had to go before anyone commented. We also have the collars, metal bands made to be worn around a human neck with a tag riveted on. Museums have them. You can read the inscriptions. They say things like, "I have run away. Hold me, return me to my master, and you will be paid." These were not written by the enslaved. They were written in the first person, on their behalf, by the person who owned them. Somebody sat down and composed a sentence for another human being to wear. And then, once a year, the whole thing turned upside down. For a few days in December during Saturnalia, the rules inverted. Slaves were allowed to speak freely, to gamble, to insult their owners to their faces. In some households, the owner served the meal, and everybody understood that it lasted exactly as long as it was allowed to last. Which is the tell. A holiday where the powerless get to behave like people for 3 days is not a crack in the system, it is maintenance. And people did run constantly, enough that it became an industry of its own. Rome had professional slave catchers. You hired them the way you would hire anyone else. They worked on commission and they were good at it. There were notices posted in public describing the missing person, height, build, accent, scars, what they were wearing when they went. Roman missing person adverts for property. And if you were caught, the punishment was usually a letter, not a written one. 3 letters, FUG, burned into the forehead. Fugitivus, runaway, which tells you something about how the collars actually worked. A collar can be removed by a sympathetic blacksmith. A brand on the face cannot be removed by anybody. It follows you into every room you will ever walk into for the rest of your life, and it announces the one thing about you that you were trying to leave behind. Some owners preferred the collar precisely because it was reversible. If the person was eventually freed, a brand would still be sitting there on the face of a Roman citizen, and that had a way of embarrassing everyone involved. So the obvious question, with those numbers, why did the whole thing not simply collapse? A third of the population, why was there not a revolt every year? There were revolts. 3 big ones, and the last is the only name most people know. A gladiator called Spartacus broke out of a training school with about 70 men and kitchen equipment for weapons, and over 2 years built an army that beat Roman legions repeatedly in the field. It ended the way these things ended. The revolt was crushed, and the survivors were crucified along the road from Capua to Rome. 6,000 crosses, spaced out along a single highway, left standing. That road was the main route into the capital, which means it was not a punishment. The men on the crosses were already finished. It was a message, and it was aimed at everyone who would walk that road for the next several years. Rome did not usually need to do this. That is the point of doing it once. And there is a quieter question that almost nobody asks about this system. What happened when you simply got old or sick enough that you could no longer work? Officially, nothing. You were maintained, the way a farmer maintains a lame ox, for exactly as long as that made economic sense. Unofficially, there was a practice everybody knew about. You took the sick person across the river to a small island in the Tiber where there was a temple, and you left them there. Not killed, abandoned. If the god cured them, wonderful. If not, the problem had solved itself, and it had not technically been anybody's fault. It became common enough that the Emperor Claudius had to make a ruling about it, and the ruling is revealing. He did not ban it. He decreed that anyone abandoned that way, who then recovered, was free, and that any owner who killed a slave rather than abandoning them would be charged with murder. So the law finally arrived. It arrived to tidy up the paperwork of people being left on an island. But mass violence is only half the answer, and it is the less interesting half, because Rome had something far more effective than crosses. Roman slavery had an exit, a real one, used constantly, and this is the thing that makes it genuinely different from the system most viewers will be thinking of. The Romans freed people, routinely, in enormous numbers, so many in fact that emperors eventually passed laws to slow it down. Here is how it worked. An enslaved person was allowed to accumulate a private fund. It was called the peculium, and legally it still belonged to the owner. In practice, everybody treated it as the slave's own money. You could save it, you could trade with it, some men ran businesses with it, and when it was large enough, you could use it to buy yourself, paying your owner the market price for your own body. Which means a great many Roman slaves spent years working to purchase the one piece of property they were never allowed to own. And once you follow that money far enough, you arrive somewhere genuinely strange. Because if an enslaved man could hold a fund, he could spend it on whatever he liked, and some of them spent it on a slave of their own. The Romans had a word for that too. Vicarious, a person who was property, who owned property, which was a person. Nobody in Rome found that especially confusing. It was just how the ledger worked. And owners agreed to it cheerfully because the arithmetic worked for them. You got paid full price for someone who was going to get old anyway. You kept a grateful, obligated ally instead of an enemy. And every slave in your household watched it happen and understood the rules. That last part is the engine. Hope is a cheaper security system than chains. A man who believes he can buy his way out in 12 years does not join a revolt in year 3. The exit door did not exist in spite of the system. The exit door was load-bearing. And when the door opened, it opened properly. A freed slave in Rome did not become a permanent underclass with a different name. He became a Roman citizen, not a full one. There were restrictions, real ones. A freedman could not hold high office, and he owed his former owner ongoing duties. But he was a citizen. He could sue. He could own property in his own name. He could vote. And his children, born after his freedom, were full citizens with no asterisk at all. 1 generation. That was the entire gap. Cicero's secretary was an enslaved man named Tiro. He was freed, stayed on as a friend, edited his former owner's letters, and is generally credited with inventing a shorthand system that was still in use in European monasteries 1,000 years later. Freedmen became some of the richest men in the empire. They dominated whole trades. They funded public buildings and put their names on them, which the old aristocracy found unbearably vulgar and complained about constantly, and you can still read the complaints, which is its own kind of satisfying. One emperor's father had been a freed slave. So now put the two halves together, and you get the thing that is genuinely difficult about Roman slavery. It was not built on the idea that some kinds of people are born to be property. There was no racial theory underneath it. A Roman slave could be Greek, Syrian, British, German, African, or Italian, and frequently was. Nobody constructed an elaborate argument about why a particular sort of person deserved this, because nobody needed one. You were not enslaved for what you were. You were enslaved because you lost a battle, a lawsuit, an argument with the sea, which sounds, at first, almost less monstrous. It is not. It is worse in a specific way, and the specific way is this. If slavery is justified by a theory about who people are, then the theory can be attacked. You can prove it false. That is, in the end, how such arguments get dismantled. But Rome never made that argument, so there was nothing to refute. Slavery was not a belief anyone held. It was simply the floor everyone was standing on. And you cannot argue a floor away. That is why there was no Roman abolition movement, not a failed one, not a small one. There was never one at all across 1,000 years of Roman history, in a civilization that produced brilliant lawyers, moral philosophers, and men who wrote at length about human dignity. Several of them owned people while writing it. Seneca, the same man who recorded that line about the headcount, wrote movingly that slaves are human beings, that they should be treated with kindness, that fortune has power over all of us. He never suggested freeing them as a class. The most humane voice in the room was arguing for better management. So, one last detail. When a Roman slave was freed, there was a small ceremony, and part of it involved putting a particular hat on his head. A soft felt cap, conical, with the tip folded forward. It was called the pallius, and it meant one thing to everyone who saw it. This man was owned, and now he is not. That hat did not disappear. It was picked up almost 2,000 years later by people who had read their Roman history and wanted a symbol for exactly that idea. It went on to the heads of French revolutionaries. It went on to flags, seals, and coins. It is still sitting on official emblems today, including several in the United States where it is called the Liberty Cap. So the symbol modern republics chose to represent freedom itself is a hat that was invented to mark the exact moment a person stopped being furniture. Rome did not give us that symbol because Rome was free. Rome gave us that symbol because Rome needed a way to tell at a glance who wasn't. The Senate refused to put a uniform on the enslaved in case they counted themselves, but they were perfectly happy to put a hat on the ones who got out, because that number was small enough to be safe. Which of those details stuck with you? The collar with the sentence written on it, the eels, the 6,000 crosses, or the hat? Tell me, because I genuinely cannot decide which one is worse.